Section 1.4 of your textbook describes some of the changes in terms of what Americans expect the federal government to do and how satisfied Americans are with the federal government. Maybe this will be a surprise to you, or maybe it won't be, but as the federal government has taken on more and more responsibilities to meet the needs of the American people, the population has become less and less satisfied with government. Interestingly, Americans tend to be pretty supportive of individual government programs. If you ask Americans what they think individually about Social Security or Medicare or defense spending, education, environmental programs, or pretty much anything else the government does, they will mostly tell you they're either satisfied or they want government to do more in each of those areas. But when you ask Americans generally if they think government is too big or too small, most will say it's too big. This is something of a paradox. How can Americans like pretty much every government program, but dislike government overall? I'm afraid I can't actually answer that question for you. It's something I hope you will ponder a bit over the course of the semester. But this lecture will give a little bit of context to the political issue of government's size and role in American life. So, if we're going to talk about the size and role of the federal government, the first thing I want to draw your attention to is the importance of the Great Depression and World War II as a transformative period for American government. Prior to the Depression, the federal government was relatively small. Most of the day-to-day work of government was done at the state and local level. If you look at the starting point of this chart, just before the onset of the Great Depression, you'll see that federal receipts, in other words taxes, accounted for about 4% of GDP, or gross domestic product. In other words, for every dollar of economic activity in the United States, the federal government collected about 4 cents in tax revenue. But through the 1930s and into the 1940s, first as FDR's New Deal programs kicked in to try to cope with the Depression, and then as the United States mobilized to fight World War II, federal tax revenue exploded to nearly 20% of GDP, and never returned back anywhere close to their previous levels. Basically, in a period of just over 10 years, American national government had been transformed from a model that had been based on a largely rural, pre-industrial ideal in which the nation could get along with minimal involvement from the central government, to a modern industrial ideal in which the national government was a key player in developing the United States as a world economic and military power. Okay, so government is definitely bigger than it was, but is it too big? Times have changed, and so have Americans' expectations of government. Maybe another way of looking at this issue is to see how the United States compares to other countries. The chart on this slide shows public social spending in what are called OECD countries. OECD stands for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and is made up of most of the world's largest economies. Public spending is spending on government programs for things like Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, disability and unemployment insurance, and food stamps. The average spending for OECD countries is 21% of GDP. The United States comes in a little ways below the average at 19% of GDP. So the amount of government spending towards social purposes relative to the size of our economy is actually relatively small compared to most other developed countries. Another context for considering the size of government is to examine the things government spends money on. As you can see on this slide, 3 areas dominate federal spending: healthcare programs, Social Security, and defense and homeland security. Those 3 alone account for about 70% of federal spending. If you're concerned that government is too big, you're going to have to wrestle with these areas of spending. We have very high healthcare costs in this country that are only projected to increase as our elderly population grows and requires more medical care. How does government reduce health spending without overburdening individual citizens, many of whom are already struggling to pay their healthcare costs? How does government reduce Social Security spending without reneging on the promises made to today's seniors who paid into that system for many years with the assurance that they would be taken care of in their retirement years? How does government reduce its defense spending without jeopardizing its alliances that have helped maintain comparative peace since World War II, or without becoming stingier in salary and benefits to our military personnel. I'm not saying it cannot be done, but I would just say that these are tricky issues with no simple solutions. One final note on this pie chart. This includes federal spending only, so state and local spending picks up some of the slack in areas that look very small on this chart, particularly education and transportation. I hope you found this information useful in better understanding the size and role of government in American life.